Yeah, it's apply but I mean,
Dan, I'm just checking. Has Tito joined?
yeah, she's not in.
Okay, and then just test with her quickly that she can unmute herself and put on her camera.
So let's put hundreds of minutes of production. But don't mistake because yeah, I'm just going to speak to the person responsible.
So, yeah, did we heat up the water? This here, let's maybe just get it. You're welcome to drink coffee whilst we're talking. It's very informal. It's a really around the fire discussion.
We haven't been to the last one or two that you've had.
You came to the one that I presented, the one last year on farmers in Mbatha.
Yes, I definitely.
Yeah,
I don't know how many you've had this year.
we only have had two, but one was remote.
And now I'm just like my child, like, can you have vegetables? Oh, I forgot about you, my vegetables. Oh, you have two children. And then, you know, I think I have 10. So now I'm like, so I'm going to leave early. He's 17. So I'm like, he's going to.
Where is he?
I'm just asking if we can hang out at his friend's hospital. Oh, hello.
Hello. This is a camera. So, you know, it's me. My laptop is messed up, so I got a. So if let me see, you can see me there. If you can see my face properly, you see that one. Can you see me? Am I fine there? Because that's what everyone's.
Oh, we'll see you on the other side.
That's yeah.
What are you going to project?
The presentation. So it's just like, but with the in-house people are here, the online people are there, and they can also see the. Risha, am I sharing this? I'm sharing the screen there.
Yes, Prof, you're sharing your presentation, the full presentation.
I know he wasn't here because now I reached the one draft, but I have two. And now it's like, can you reach? Oh, you.
No, you
The other one. And I've taken the car. It was also in here. But now.
Please have coffee, the biscuits as well for those who. Please have. You want me to go cut the cake?
That's intimidating. Oh, yes.
Yes, they must start the youth.
No, I haven't even looked at your submission.
Maybe I'll tell you.
That's what we can only submitted on yesterday. You know, because I said I'm back, I got my all the submissions, I hope this is that I have to read external examining that I did this morning. A proposal for the expertise. Yeah, so I haven't got, but I will prioritize.
It's all.
In privilege, in Finland.
Live tomorrow, take leave of the needs and nice to. So we can put office for the next. Tomorrow is.
You might.
And the following Sunday, on the weekend, that Sunday, we look to lunch. Because it's just.
Hey, that's how it's done.
They just have to show.
Tito, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you see me?
I cannot see you. Is your camera switched on?
It is on. Wait,
It's just a blank screen. And also you've joined on 2 devices.
let me unjoin
Okay.
on the one. Because I was, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we cannot see you.
Because earlier on, I was struggling to join or turn on my cameras, and then I went and joined on another device. But my camera is on.
We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Let me do this.
Okay, someone's laptop is echoing. I'm not sure who. I think we're going to start. Sizo,
Yes.
I think, can you go on mute? I just want to see if there's an echo. Test 1, 2. Okay, so there's something going on with your laptop. I'm not sure. You probably entered MS Teams twice. You know, if sometimes you open it and then it's on the web, but it's also on the app, then it does the echoing. Just remember that for future with MS Teams. If you've got it installed on your computer and then you also open it on the web, then it echoes between the two, okay? All right. Otherwise, let me start. Sorry, whose batch is this one? Okay. All right. Then you're going to have to close this door, I think, just this one. People can come in and then just. Lele two. Okay, okay, you were sitting there. Later, I'm going to put your bag maybe this side, okay? Is it fine? Okay. All right. Thank you. And no, actually, I'm not the chair. Sorry, but we are here, Risha. We are ready. Over to you.
Okay, great, fantastic. Thank you, Prof. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the seminar this afternoon. It's always lovely to see some of our students in the seminar room, but also thank you so much to everyone who has joined us online to engage in this important discussion, which unpacks the dynamics surrounding agricultural activities in youth-headed households in South Africa. But before we begin, please note that the proceedings are being recorded and will be made available on the IACR YouTube channel and across our various social media platforms. So my name is Risha Kara. I'm a researcher at the IACR, and I will be the hosting chair for this afternoon. A little background on the ICR before we get started. So we have 4 key research areas, which include human and economic development, skills development and education research, cross-border trade in Africa, and environmental resources and management. In addition to this, we also offer a very sought-after honors degree, which is aimed at training the next generation of social and economic policymakers, and an opportunity also for master's and PhD candidates to study with us. We also host a number of training workshops, but for further information on this, you're welcome to visit our website, pop into the Institute, or drop us an email. So today's topic reminds us of that time where we get to remember South Africa's youth who had sacrificed themselves for the present South Africa, which was meant to be democratically, economically, and racially free. So the Institute of Social and Economic Research, which co-houses the Future Earth Africa Hub Leadership Center at Rhodes University, invites you to look into a piece of South Africa's future through a window of socio-economic burdens that are still proportionally carried by Black and colored youth in agriculture. So the presentation today will highlight patterns of proportional gains and losses across racial and gender lines among the youth using data from 2002 and 2019 General Household Survey. So Prof. Mbatha, who is the director of the ICR, has been producing meaningful research focused on the various factors linked to agriculture, not only in South Africa, but in many other African countries. Prof is an environmental economist by training and conducts research on natural resource management, including research on land and water laws, agricultural economics, and land reform projects across the African continent. His other research interests include topics on the interface of labor markets and skills development. So Prof is very well versed in this topic and has spent the last few months wading through data to paint a picture of youth household heads and the various factors linked to household agricultural engagement. So in keeping with Youth Month, and Prof, of course, is our presenter for today. So in keeping with Youth Month, today's respondent is Ms. Tito Hove, who is an honors student in the Department of Politics and International Studies, or International Relations, at Rhodes University, and who has recently completed an ICR module focusing on training policymakers in the social and economic landscape of South Africa. So engaging a student in this manner is a first for ICR and our ongoing seminar series. However, Ms. Hove showed enthusiasm in the topic, and we feel that it is best to hear from the youth about youth-related issues. Ms. Hove holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and is currently completing an honors degree in political and international studies at Rhodes University under the John Conradi Scholarship in recognition of her strong academic record and community engagement efforts. Some of her research delves into the political economy of the Global South, with a focus on justice, state power, and the intersections of race, gender, and class. Okay, so a heartfelt thank you to Prof. Mbatha and Ms. Hove for taking the time to share with us this afternoon as we anticipate a very thought-provoking and engaging discussion on youth and agriculture. So this seminar will work as follows. Prof. Mbatha will present for about 25 minutes, followed by a response from Ms. Hove for about 10 minutes. Thereafter, we will enter into a time of questions and comments. For those who are joining us online, please post your questions in the chat box throughout the discussion, and we will attend to them at the end of the presentations. And for those who are attending in person, please feel free to share your questions with us during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So without further delay, it is my privilege to hand over to Prof. Mbatha. Prof?
Thank you, Risha. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Fantastic. My name is Cyril Mbatha. Yes, I'm the one presenting, and I'm very excited that you are all here. And to me, you look like the youth I'm talking about, most of you. So really appreciated that you came. So some of the questions will be posed on you anyway, or will be about you. And also some instructions on so what possible research you could embark on, on your own issues. So the topic for today, the rising socioeconomic burden on youth in South Africa, and we're looking at racial redistributions of resources. We chose the 2 years, 2002, because it's just years after 1998 when many of the land reform laws and policies were enacted. So we thought there's enough time for them to start having an effect at that point. And we also wanted to have this nice gap of like a decade or 2 decades after, but we ended up not really going for 2022, rather 2019, because we wanted to avoid COVID-related effects, because otherwise there would be noise and distortions. That's why now it kind of like looks odd that 2002, 2019, what is going on? But what motivated this study really was the paper that we presented in Kenya last month that was looking at how the land-related reform policies have had an effect on vulnerable communities. So we looked at women, and it's not just us who are doing this, but we're doing it in Kenya, we're doing it in Ghana, and then we just went there to present our results on vulnerable groups. And that paper specifically focused on women, on how they have been affected, or rather what has happened in the last, say, around about 20 years. But whilst doing that, we also realized that there were gains and losses for women, but for the youth, there were big losses, and we got worried about that. So we thought maybe we must dig further into the data, just specifically focusing on youth. For example, women heads of households, by the way, the reason why we used heads of households as opposed to just any woman or any youth, because here today we're looking at youth-headed households, it's because we feel that if there's an impact on the head of household, it's a bigger impact, not just on the individual. So it's a better way of us to have a feeling on how big the effect or the negative or positive would be if it's on those people who are heads. So, and then we found that there were some gains, a number of gains that were made by women, but there were also some losses. But there were promises that were coming through from the data. Although overall, men were still dominating, in most of the indicators that we chose, and you will see them. The gains, for example, for women were on tenure. Suddenly, more Black women had land tenure, both in rural and urban areas. And we were a little bit worried. We went and checked whether this was the case also in tribal areas for women-headed households. We found that it actually was the case, that there were improvements. So that was a promising development. Also, access to a bigger land size, there were positive gains there. We always expected that there would be a high level of productivity or activity in production of field crops for women. As well as monthly spending power, it really improved, which for us indicated maybe a growing middle class. And then the losses, we did not understand why the number of women in 2019 as a proportion of other groups, their share on receipts of land grants had dropped. And we also didn't understand why their share of big cattle heads, not just 1 or 2 cattle in the household, but sort of like mid to bigger, especially if we're dealing with auctions, market auctions for cattle, for them to be able to participate in market auctions, that had dropped for women. So so that was a negative finding that we thought, we reported on. In any case, like I said, men still were ahead on most of the indicators. I actually don't remember that in any of the indicators, women were ahead. Women may have improved a lot compared to men, but in total, men were still ahead. You know, those are the type of trends that we found. So, yeah, there by race, Black race gaining on incomes gained from salaries, which for us indicates that more and more Black people and women are gaining employment in the formal sector on salaried income. So the data or the survey asks questions like, where is most of your income coming from? From salaries, from remittances, from grants. So if it's coming from wages and salaries, that indicates jobs for us. So there were lots of gains that were made there, but not in business. There were, surprisingly, there were drops in remittances. I mean, in 2002 or even before then, lots of money coming from urban spaces into rural areas. That seems to be going down in the recent years. For youth, the loss were on many more indicators, including tenure, income from salaries, etc. Therefore, we wanted to interrogate them. So some of the literature review that's about this, you know, just doing a typical academic paper, literature review, divided up into issues of pre-transfer of the land that is targeted for the land reform project. Various issues have been reported, nausea by various people, including myself, Hall, Ben Cousins. You know, if you know these people, and many of these people are working in the land reform projects. So issues like farm evictions, recently now politics on compensation, but also just the administration and entrenched structures that are preventing the acquisition of the land to be then transferred to targeted vulnerable communities. Just bad government coordination. Land affairs is doing its own thing, agriculture is doing its own thing, and then, you know, the administration there. But some of the problems are really legal, just in terms of the disputes on who should be the beneficiaries, and then valuation. So all those are discussed by various people. And then post-transfer issues of high project failure rates, once the land has been acquired, disputes about how it should be managed, if it's a collective group of people who've acquired the land, often you find fights there, and then sometimes those fights lead into the collapse of the projects in place. Where people are trying to cooperate with one another, then there are issues on how do we raise capital, how do we get trained, you know, the support from government for us to succeed. There are issues there discussed by various people. So we are expecting that there are issues, you know, when you are looking at the framework on how policies are, you know, are discussed, who comes into the table to set the agenda for what policy should, you know, how the policy should be defined, and then how the policy is then implemented, you know, and then all right through that whole cycle, there are various issues. So, and yeah, so for this paper and the other paper, we use this because we really focused on policy, especially for the students in the ICR, just in the policy cycle and problems right through the cycle. This study in particular focuses on the evaluation stage, which is that a stage there, and then going back into the agenda setting. So how do we reassert the agenda, stage one? Some of the methods used, the qualitative reviews, obviously, as I've explained to you, pre-transfer issues, post-transfer of the land issues, you know, that kind of sort of like identifying themes that and putting them, grouping them as these are issues before the land has been acquired, these are the issues, you know, that kind of systematic, thematic sorting out of the challenges in the literature. And then the quantitative, like I said, we avoided 2020 to 2023 because of COVID effects. So we can't nicely say we did a 20-year study. It's almost a 20-year study. And we looked at our youth. The way that we define it is everybody 35 and below, and who are heads of households. There are also children who are heading households. We didn't look specifically at who is below 18 and is heading a household. So we just focus, we just group them all together as young people who are heading households. But we can't do that if you know there are burning questions around that. So really the exploration on how we do this is that we look at the impacts for all the indicators that we have. What is the status quo in 2002? Say, for example, if we are looking at access to land, what is the percentage of each group that we are looking at that have got access to land? And then we divide them up. The total share should be 100%. If women or youth only have 50%, we report that. So it's a share in 2002. And then we say, okay, so we've discovered that percentage share in 2002. What is it 20 years later in 2019? If it has gone down to 40% for the youth, the group that we're interested in, we can clearly see there that the share for this particular indicator for the youth has dropped. Has dropped by, if you are looking at absolute values, it's dropped obviously by 10%. But we don't use that absolute value of percentage drop. We use a relative percentage share, which means that the difference that we're looking at, or change that we're looking at, is relative to 2002, the figure that was reported in 2002. What does that mean? If in 2002 the share was 10%, in 2019 the share was 11%, an increase from 10 to 11 is 10%, if you have to understand it in that sense. So it's a percentage share increase or decrease relative to what it was in 2002. So it's not just 1% increase. Okay. So that's what we do there. And then we also check whether or not that change is statistically significant, which means that the data is robust enough for us to be at least 95% sure, have that level of confidence, that at 95% level of confidence, we are sure that this is what has happened. We report on that by looking at the range of the confidence intervals for the reported percentages there. And I'll show you how we do that. Yeah, we do that. And then also we look at, if we are doing tabulations, we also just look at the reported p-values. If the value is below 0.05, we accept that what the pattern that we are finding, we can be confident at a 95% level of confidence level that is acceptable. So really, that's how statistical significance works. It doesn't tell us how big the effect is. It just tells us that we are sure that the effect that we are finding is stable. Okay. So this exploration then may tell us where we are in 2019 at least, but not so much how we got there. I mean, we can sort of like extrapolate from various indicators that are related. If we see more than 1, 2, 3 indicators sort of moving the same direction, we can make some extrapolations there. And you will see when we try to do things like that. Yeah, so the benchmarks, if we were talking about parity, looking for, what level, what is equal? So we use normal benchmarkings of, population groups, percentage shares. In 2002, for example, almost 80% of the population, at least in the group that we're looking at of household heads, was 79.8%. So I'm jumping the gun. The total number of household heads in 2002 was just above 11 million. Of that, 3.1 million were youth-headed households, which is 23%. When we go to 2019, we find 17, so that the total number of household heads has increased, obviously with the population. But what is worrying is that the share of that has also increased. So more and more households are becoming headed by the youth or young people below the age of 35. This we find to be a negative development. Increase in total number of youth headed. It's not just the increase from 3.1 to 4.6, but it's the relative share of the whole population of households heads that are now youth. Okay, so really when you are looking at whether people have gained and whether, you know, an indicator is reflecting whether or not there is a share benefit to the rest of the population by race, we use this as sort of like a benchmark for parity based on what is the total contribution of each population of household heads into the total population of all the races. So this is what it was in 2002. And you can see that for other races, in fact, I was talking to a colleague of mine who works in the Department of Basic Education, who was telling me that there has been a drop in white racial demographics in South Africa. Some because of migration, and this is also reflected on only if you are looking at household heads. Same has happened to Indians, same has happened to colored people. The only growing demographic in terms of household heads are Africans, as you can see there. So this is in itself an interesting finding about what's happening in the South African socio-economic landscape. Now, let's go into some of the findings. Full share of tenure. This is tenure that you are not renting your land or property that you own, it's fully paid off, it's full tenure. It's not rented, it's not illegally occupied. And like with the rest of the population in the SRI paper, which did not only look at youth, but looked at everyone, all the households, there is a significant gain in paid off tenure, both males and females. There you can see there is a rise there for Africans, and there's also a rise there for colored people. And this is the case, like I said, also in traditional spaces, in tribal land, because this data allows us to look at what is happening to our household heads, because we wanted to see whether there were things happening. I mean, even my assumptions, I was surprised by that, would have been that in traditional areas, women would have been negatively affected, and it's not the case. The share may not have grown as much as the men, but it has grown. Okay. And then the decrease was really carried, you can see there. I don't know if white and Indian people now are renting more, you know, because we excluded rented properties. But another thing that could have happened, these are the speculations now to try and explain this, which can't come really from the data, not at least in the way that it's been. So one other suspicion is that the RDP effect in Black and colored townships, you know, so that may have had a big push into people gaining full tenure for the properties that they now own, which is a positive development in itself. But now looking at racial dynamics, the question we could ask is whether or not white and Indian youth-headed households, how could they benefit? Can they benefit from RDP policies or projects in townships? For example, in Pretoria, you find lots of informal shanty towns where only white people live there. but not necessarily in townships. So there is something there to be explored around tenure and about white, poor, people who don't have a full tenure but might benefit from RDP projects. So anyone who's looking at settlements, urban settlements, at least, I think this could be an interesting topic, especially for young Indian and white youth-headed households. Then we looked at the percentage changes of access to agricultural land. I was surprised here that even though we have got policies directly aimed at fixing this, that is the backdrop, particularly for at least the whole Black population. But we find that there are losses. The percentage share, it moved from 94% to 91% 20 years later, with a relative drop of 3.4%. Although it's not significant, it is there. And for colored people, there is a rise. I was really, and it's a big rise. I was not, why was it so low in 2002? I would not have expected that. But anyway, it's increased by a lot in the last 20 years. It's also increased for the white population. The figures for Indian, no observation, or it's just a small sample for us to report on. So those are two things against agricultural land policies aimed at empowering previously disadvantaged people. This is the effect 20 years later. For colored people, to me, it's very positive, and you'll see why it's really positive for colored people, because once they've got access to agricultural land, other things also start happening. So how did this happen is a question that I have. How did Black youth heads become losers with policies in place? Are there any other external factors? How did colored youth take up on these opportunities? Just then, and then when you look at then agricultural productivity, you would expect that people who've got access then would have activity. But you see that the rise in agricultural activity, comparative rise, is so much bigger than just the rise in access. So a small bit of access, well, it's not small for colored, it was 141%, but it led to 3 times bigger size in terms of then engaging with agricultural production, by young people, young-headed households. For Africans who had lost access, they've also lost activity. For white people who had gained access, the activity also rose. So there is a positive relationship there between having access intuitively as well as statistically. For colored people, is especially statistically significant. All right. So again, how have Black young heads been left behind with policies in place is a question, e.g. as land grant targets. Are these all the effects of the challenges that have been discussed by people like Hall, like Ben Cousins, in the last 20 years? Issues of maladministration, issues of disputes, issues of, just young people are just ignored in this whole space, such that they are these losers in this system. So I think that a more complex systems approach to this study, more case study based approach to this, to understand what has happened with colored people, especially how did they take up the opportunities? Maybe it's a regional thing in the Western Cape. I'm not sure, but I think that would have to be a case study to look at really what has happened amongst the colored people for them to have been able to get ahead or to take advantage of these policy opportunities. And you can expect that if you don't have access, you are not productive, chances are you are more likely to experience food insecurity. And that's the case. For Africans, severe cases of hunger are much are much bigger. In fact, in 2019, the only group that reported severe cases of food insecurity were Africans. For colored people, it had dropped, to zero. So you can see there's a pattern there that is developing. It is therefore it should be really worrying that while young blackheads have experienced drops in access and land, but they also experience these severe cases of hunger. So the burden of hunger, at least, was carried only by blacks. It was eradicated for colored youth. That's positive. And both changes were significant, i.e. that they are reliable and stable. Why? So if land policies are not making an impact on Black youth, why is the increased share in the burden of hunger not making an impact? That's the question that we need to ask. So there are lots of more, the burden of hunger is carried by African young-headed households or young people who are heading households, but that is not driving them into being food productive. Is it because there is something in the middle, maybe the access to land? There's a problem there because first you have to have access, and so what is the stumbling block to have access to land if the policies are in place to enable access to land? So it's really a question that needs, because otherwise we found no associations from hunger cases and agricultural activities. We didn't find that we can put them together. When we tabulate those together, they are not significantly associated. So it could be other external, because policies don't work in isolation. You've got other policies from other departments that are trying to do other things that are having effect on young people, whether in urban spaces or in rural spaces. So you find, so the questions that logically we should be able to find answers for, heads don't make sense because the interference of various things that are going on amongst the youth. Okay. So so then the question is, what about social grants? For example, in first-best economies, one would expect that social grants don't have a role because, the argument that, if you are receiving a social grant, what's the point of engaging in agricultural activity that is minimally just getting you out of poverty when social grants are doing that? There's that argument. But it's best, in first-best economies, obviously you wouldn't expect social grants to play a role, but amongst vulnerable economies with insecurities, they do the protection. Okay, they are there for the protection. So what is then the role of grants? Is it a double-edged sword? It's like, is it a chicken and egg situation where there is hunger, and then social grants kick in, and then to get out of that hunger, because you've got social grants, then you don't participate in agricultural productivity? Are we experiencing something like that? Among Black young heads, cases of severe hunger are higher for grant recipients than for people who are receiving remittances, and they are lower for salary people, especially lower for people who are running private businesses. This for us indicates, and this is statistically significant, this indicates for us that if the chances of you being not hungry are in place if you've got access to a salaried income or if you've got a business. And we find that Indian race group and white race, they have their representation in grant recipients, for example, is very low. Although the remittances for white people for some reason has increased, but their representation in formal jobs has also dropped. More and more are running their own private businesses and are receiving money from remittances, whether it's maybe through grandparents or I don't know where the remittances are coming from. But there clearly the pattern you can see that if you're a grant recipient, you are more likely from that group, we are more likely to find people who are experiencing severe cases of hunger. Earning income from a business or salary is associated with being less hungry. So the question is, should we be pushing then people into creating jobs? I mean, that sounds logical, creating jobs and making sure young people are building their own private businesses, because that means that they are less likely to be not food insecure. Or should we be supporting them with grants, because they are in such a place now where maybe it's not possible for us to create jobs anymore because the economy has failed, and we can't assist them in building up these businesses. So we are stuck in a second best option, or a second best economy, so to speak. So we are somewhere where we can't get out of this trap. So yeah, so that's the thing there. We know that salary jobs have dropped, especially for the youth. So maybe the thing of looking at salary jobs as a savior, because really if people do have jobs, they get out of poverty, is also becoming a limited option because unemployment is on the increase, especially for young people. So there's a catch-22 there. Okay.
Prof,
Hello.
Prof, sorry, just 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Reminder.
I'm going to just have to ask for a little bit more time. Yeah, okay. So who's getting grants anyway? As you can see, Africans are getting grants. So grants associated with severe cases of hunger. And that has increased. But for colored people, it has decreased. So in most indicators, you find that Africans and colored people are sort of like performing similarly. Indian people and white people, although there is not enough data for Indians, they're sort of like more or less on many indicators. But the colored people are outperforming in some, especially in this particular case, Africans, when it comes to severe cases of hunger and in the agricultural sector, access to land and productive, being productive there. So yeah, so I'm asking those questions again about a sharp decline in jobs and what the prospects are. How do we get Black youth into agricultural business activities, for example? Is because businesses matter, agricultural productivity matter for cases of hunger. Yeah, so, and then I wanted to look at spending power, because, you know, when you ask people for incomes, people don't really tell you give you the true, most honest answers, especially if you ask them to self-report it. What do you earn? You know, it's a very difficult question. So I thought maybe I should look at spending power. What are they reporting to be spending? Here, I found a little bit of a problem with the data itself, because from 2002 to 2019, the highest level of income per month that you can report is 10,000 rands. But 10,000 rands in 2002 is not 10,000 rands in 2019. So if you are looking at that figure, you'll be looking at two different values in real terms. If you are using the adjusted value CPI, it's about 6,500 in 2019. So really you are comparing two different things. You might find that more Black people can spend beyond 10,000 rands, because really that's, you know, it doesn't really tell you the true story. So I wanted a figure that was maybe 6,500 in the data for 2019, and then I can compare that to 10,000 rands in 2022. But I couldn't find that category because the data only had 2,500, 5,000, and 10,000. And I thought 1,500 for especially poor people is a lot of money. If you try and report on that, it still wouldn't be accurate enough. But if you are interested in using this data in terms of what has happened, using the data as it is, you find that this is the growing middle class that I was talking about. For young, Black headed households, there has been an increase of almost 190%. And then on the other hand, there's been a decrease for white. I don't remember now. No, they are both significant because I put 2 stars on them. But then if you go back to the benchmark table that I gave to you, you still find that, like with men and women, although there has been an improvement for women, in this case, an improvement for young Black youth, relative, when you look overall, men are still ahead. In this case, even though there has been a drop for white youth-headed households, but overall, in terms of proportional share of, spending power, white people are still ahead if you are using the racial parity benchmark for spending power. Otherwise, in terms of achieving that parity, the figures or the trend is suggesting that we are on track. But otherwise, I'm not very comfortable with doing this because I feel like, yeah, this in 2019, this is the correct figure that should have been used, but it doesn't exist in the data because these are the categories that are there. So my head is buffering. So maybe somebody bright can tell me what would be a nice way to do this comparison. In any case, overall, I'm summarizing now. Overall, you can see there that on most indicators, at least the ones that we looked at that are related to the agricultural sector, Africans have been the most negatively affected in terms of each. And then, yeah, the other racial groups are sort of like similarly affected, but more and more you can see that the burden on the youth is becoming more and more shared amongst the different races. In the past, it was skewed against especially Africans, to a degree, colored people, but it's becoming more and more equally distributed, although Africans still carry the bigger share of the problem. Yeah, that's what I'm reporting there. The dynamic, so some of the thoughts that I'm leaving you with, yeah, the burden seems to be getting more equally distributed. That's the case. The bigger problem for all young heads is that the share of the total burden has increased for the youth. So if you just compare the youth to the older generations, the burden on the youth has grown, irrespective of what racial group or gender you are looking at. The dynamics on access to land, productivity in agriculture, and hunger for Black people is a question. As you know, I don't know what it is that we can learn about what has happened to colored young heads that we can emulate. I don't know what it is that we need to get the answers from what has happened there, because it's a positive story that's coming out of that. And then obviously opportunities from jobs are diminishing. So this is really a fundamental shift that although jobs are important, the fact that they are diminishing, it means that the opportunities from jobs are becoming more limited. So anyway, more opportunities for Indian and white young heads are coming really from remittances and businesses. So these patterns are not only about the past, June 16, and how they've now changed in the present. But I think because we are talking about young people, they have got a big impact of what we are going to be looking at in the near future, which if it continues like this, the burden grows for young people, then the future of the country is not sustainable. Thank you.
Much, Prof, for that presentation. I think you definitely deep dive into the statistics to prove this argument that youth continue to fall into this vulnerable category, and they also continue to bear the burden of various factors of inequality. So thank you so much for that, for the presentation. I think just over time, we've noticed that youth are continuously negatively impacted from the various social and economic crises that our country has experienced and continue to experience. And I think in general, it's also interesting or important to point out that South Africa is known to have a progressive constitution and to also have progressive social and economic policies in which youth features a designated group for intervention. However, the effective implementation of these policies are clearly a problem. And as a result, we are seeing this now negative impact on youth and so many years later as well. So thank you for highlighting that for us, Prof. So I'm very excited to now hand over to Titso. As mentioned, Titso Ms. Hove is a student, an honors student in the Department of Politics, and she's also linked to the IACR, and she has recently completed one of our modules. But also, I think it's so important in society now to hear from young people and really hear about her thoughts on the presentation, and also just some insights from maybe lived experience. So Tito, let me hand over to you. Thank you.
Yes. And Dan should be sharing my presentation.
Okay. Dan, are you ready? Okay, I can share it, no problem. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
Okay, and then you will just tell me when to change.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, hi everyone. Oh, okay.
1 second, I just want to put it into presentation
Hello?
mode.
Yes.
Is that okay?
That's perfect. So I just want to say hi everyone. I think as Risha did say at the beginning, that we've never, I think ICR has never done this before. It's been like a student and lecturer. So I don't have my PhD yet. So please don't look for my type of input that's going to be at that level. And I think I'm just going to speak from what I've read in the reading, but also pick up from what Prof. Mbatha has just presented, and also just, bring in my own expertise as, an honest student and in the different fields that I'm also touching on, as well as, from what I've learned from ISA. So I'll be presenting a youth perspective. You can go to the next slide. Okay, just my response overview. I think this is just always a nice guide so everyone's always on the same page. So the relevance of the study for the youth today, and then we're also going to touch on the results and reflection on the findings, and then policy and stakeholder interventions, as well as further studies and analysis that we are trying to bring forward as the youth. Okay, so the relevance of the study for the youth today, I just want to say, does agriculture, or there's a big question, does agriculture sector still matter for the youth today? And I want to say that yes, it does, because I think on the one hand, the agriculture sector and the broader land governance debate remain deeply connected to issues of youth livelihoods, food security, as Prof did touch on, as well as spatial justice. So young people, especially in rural areas, are still tied to land through family networks, informal farming and aspirations of economic independence. So I think the land is a resource, but one is increasingly difficult for youth to access and meaningfully. I think, as Prof did mention or has touched on in his presentation, that, we saw across all different categories or demographics that youth were the most impacted, and even, across racial lines, the youth are, disproportionately impacted to the access of land. So, however, what the study also reveals is that the rural economy is shifting. It is turning less agrarian, so more informal and increasingly reliant on grants and non-farming income. So for youth who face high unemployment and marginalization, agriculture may no longer seem like a viable livelihood path. And this raises important questions. Are we preparing youth for land-based livelihoods? And is the land reform program even designed with the youth in mind? So I think, there's, these broad discussions and these debates. And I think this is why I think the land and agriculture conversation is still relevant to the youth today. Okay, we can go to the next page. So in terms of the interesting things that I found in the findings, I labeled them, across positive, unclear, and concerning. So in terms of what the positive were, I think food security was one that, that popped up, and this is not necessarily in the category of youth, but this was more to do with the category of gender. And I think I'm going to touch on this and I'm going to connect it to social grants. So for example, food security has improved for both males and females. I'm not speaking too fast, right, Risha?
You are speaking a bit too fast. It would be great
Oh,
if you
okay.
could slow down slightly, please.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, it's difficult since I'm not in class. I'm not like gauging any faces that are like, oh my gosh, slow
No,
down.
we understand. We understand.
So essentially, I think one of the positive things, and I said that this one ties more to gender rather than youth, but it ties into social grants, and I think where social protections can come in and can also then enable the youth. So for example, the findings found that food security has improved for both males and females from 73% to 83.9% for males and from 60.95% to 81.7% for females. So that is significant, and it suggests that despite worsening tenure and declining agriculture participation, nutritional access is improving, likely due to the expansion of social grants and improved retail infrastructure. So I think this is where it touches on like how we've had almost a structure within the social grant system that has really been able to take away the gendered nature of food insecurity. And I think this also ties into the land debate, but also we can tie it into how we should then also have more of an expansionist social protection outlook that also looks at our youth unemployment, but also our youth economic activities. Now, in terms of the ones that I found unclear or ambiguous, so one of the ambiguities I noticed was tenure security. I think that the data reveals sharp declines in secured housing across both race and gender categories, but in terms, race and age, categories, but the reasons for this trend, urban migration, informalization, or poor delivery are not fully, explained in the GSH data alone. So I think there's a gap in linking the type of land access or housing with how secure people feel in practice. And then in terms of ones that I found concerning, now what stood out most likely or most starkly to me was how little has changed for the youth in 20 years. I think across nearly all categories, land ownership, cattle, salary, income, tenure, the correlations remain almost flat or worse, or they've seemed to worsen. In 2019, only 40.6% of youth reported secured housing versus 66.7% for older adults. I think that is significant intergenerational disparities. And the youth are still largely excluded from land reform and continue to be the most marginalized group without targeted policy intervention. And I don't think this will, or it doesn't seem like this will change anytime soon. And I think it just to touch on what Prof had said in his presentation on how we had that policy cycle and the resetting of agendas. And I think one of the most interesting things is to see how intentional when we do set these policies. The policymakers about engaging the youth in such things that do impact our economic activities. So yeah, okay. And the next slide. So now addressing the positives and the negatives. The positives are really good, and I hope the fact that I list a bit more negatives won't disregard the positive gains that we have made in terms of policy and stakeholder interventions. So I think the expansion of land access grants has definitely assisted more youth in getting involved in agriculture, and also as well as the continuation of gender inequality food security initiatives, also like positive things that I did take that I think we could also then apply to maybe the age brackets or as well as age specific issues. And then I think in terms of the negative things that I had seen, I think we need to develop comprehensive housing policies focusing on youth to reduce insecurity and provide affordable, stable housing. I think Prof did touch on the idea of tenure and the RDP, but I think we could definitely expand on that so it could be more expansive to the youth as well, and then also improve youth access to skills, training, credit, and market within the agricultural sector to boost income and tenure security. I think this one also touches on the post-transfer issues that we do spot within the land issues, but then also strengthen social safety nets and employment program tailored for youth and among the rural and urban areas. I think this one is very important because it also speaks to structural inequalities. So I think that's one that we can also definitely look at. And then I think also promote inclusive land reform, ensuring youth participation, especially for marginalized racial groups. So I think once again, it touches on the idea that when we're, drafting these policies, are we going out into the communities and are we engaging with the youth enough to actually see what are the needs that we might be missing on when it comes to issues of land? And then I think this is my final slide. So now further studies and analysis. So these are just, some of the things that I'm bringing forward in terms of what do I think needs to be further studied and analyzed in terms of, the conversation between land and age and the youth. So other studies to consider, I think urbanization and migration studies that explain housing insecurity trends. I think youth unemployment and entrepreneurship reports focused on agriculture and informal sectors. And then also I think maybe a gender-focused food security research assessing underlying causes of shift. And then maybe we can also then apply these to, also age-specific things. And then also a further analysis is that we need to do sectoral studies on youth engagement in emerging sectors like agribusiness, technology-driven agriculture, and green jobs. And then also maybe longitudinal studies that, are tracking youth over time to understand transition, livelihood, and vulnerability. And then studies on mental health, education access, and social capital as a part of youth well-being. And then also possibly regional analysis and comparing urban versus rural youth challenges for tailored policy interventions. So now before I close off, I think there was something that Prof did mention, and this was under social grants. And I think I just wanted to touch on this because I think because of my other courses, I've become very passionate about social grants. But in terms of this idea that when we offer, people these social protections, that it almost creates or incentivizes people to become disengaged from, the economy, or doesn't necessarily want people to then, engage with economic activities. But I think it's contrary to the fact, because when you look at different studies, for example, the IEJ, the Institute of Economic Justice, they do have a report on, labor market attitudes and as well as grant recipients. And one of the interesting things that has definitely come up is that when people have at least a little bit of social protection, being cash transfers, they are more likely to engage within the formal economy and maybe even, grow something for themselves. So I think maybe when we look at, grants, we shouldn't necessarily say, and I know we had said it's a chicken egg, social protection, does it then, deter people, or does, but I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think having better social protections or expanding our social protection or social welfare programs to also then be reaching to the youth, I think, especially within the marginalized areas in our economy, won't necessarily disengage them from, wanting to engage within sectors of the economy, such as agriculture. So I think that's just my, my little 2 cents to respond to the paper that Prof has, given us. And I hope that has sufficed.
Great, Tito. I think it's surely more than sufficed. I think you definitely brought or provided rather a different experience. A different perspective. I think more or less it sort of affirms Prof's presentation and what's coming out in the data. I also appreciate this perspective on social grants or social protection being a catalyst for youth development instead of the common narrative that the social burden on our government is too high and that it encourages a lazy labor force. So thank you so much for that, Tito. I think it's time for question and answers. So I definitely want to jump into that because it's such a topical topic. I'm sure many have lots to comment and ask on. Yes, Prof?
So whilst you're waiting for questions, I just want people can please just indicate, and we can unmute them, I think, if they want to speak through the mic. That is also fine, or they can write down their questions. But what I wanted to ask you, and including Ms. Hove, is why aren't the youth engaging in agriculture? In the light that the formal jobs are being shedded. Can anyone, for me, and why in particular African youth, when colored people seem to be doing the opposite? Like, does anybody have a guess, or maybe like you've sat somewhere with people and have explained this? I mean, Harvard touches on the fact that maybe we need to look at migration from rural areas into urban areas. But sometimes, you know, the data shows that it's harder to be poor in urban areas than it is to be in rural areas. So, what is attracting the current youth away from agriculture in a where I don't see other opportunities existing? You know, yeah, maybe we can think about that.
Can I please try?
Okay, I'll try to kind of speak. Maybe. So it's 1, 2, 3.
Already like youth being okay, already employment is a problem within South Africa, right? And then one of my research, well, my research topic within ISA last semester was basically the informal sector. And something that I realized within that was that the youth are very underrepresented within the informal sector. So I think, and then the reasoning to that for the informal sector was with the fact that the skills and training, the youth doesn't have adequate skills and training to be involved in the informal sector. So I think that that would be the same thing within the youth getting involved in agriculture as well. They don't have adequate skills.
Okay.
Yeah, please come. Greetings to the house and Archvest.
Hello.
Not to address the question directly, but I also more or less have a question in an attempt to try and answer your question.
Yeah.
So just to take a step back, for instance, when you look at rural areas, you find that most of the land is under the ownership of traditional leaders. So what comes to mind when you say this? Why has the access or participation of the youth for agricultural purposes declining? I'm thinking, are traditional leaders, first of all, advancing, or are they what's this? Or are they undermining the land rights? How are they promoting socio-economic development in these areas? Because I think even they are a stumbling block. If ever we're gonna speak about the productive use of land in these rural areas, we cannot leave them out of the conversation. So to what extent are they really promoting social economic development?
You know, there was also the paper by Hall who asked, land reform for what? So, I mean, this particular discussion is looking at land reform for access to agricultural land and then land agricultural productivity. So she was asking the question, so there are other, maybe people are also receiving land for purposes other than being economically active. And why is that not valued, you know, for other cultural values of the land, you know, just the right that this is your land. Now, don't tell me that I should now become a commercial farmer because I've got the land. I'm just happy to have this land. I don't know, maybe that's part of the answer, you know, that it's not just access to land, and the land therefore should be agricultural land, and therefore you should be agriculturally active. But you know, the question would still remain then, if there are high instances of food insecurities and hunger that could be alleviated by being active on the land, especially because colored youth are showing that it's possible. So, you know, there's, yeah, so for me, that kind of like remains the, yes, over to you, Risha.
Thanks, Prof. Prof,
Sorry, someone else. Sorry, there's someone else, Risha, in the house.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
I was going to say it could be connected to the growing middle class amongst the people. And I mean, a lot of them have a home in the rural area and in urban areas. So, for example, it's not passed down, that knowledge. You don't have the younger generation having to farm as much or rely on the land as much to sustain themselves. It's more about getting a degree And then also developments associated with this main urban area, like a suburb. So there's almost like a cultural shift. And I mean, amongst colored people, education is not really prioritized. So this is new to them. It's not new to Black people. So it's almost also makes sense why there's a decline amongst Black youth.
So are you saying that in terms of educational attainments, colored people are behind? Is that what you're saying? And therefore, sorry, I missed that point about
It's
education.
part of the point. So for example, Black people, it's like having a degree, it's just become the norm or the standard. Even an honest degree, it's not a big deal.
Okay.
Whereas in colored communities, there's like larger dropout rates. The culture around education doesn't necessarily match. So maybe for them, there's been such a huge shift because they still haven't reached that place where the benchmark is having a degree. So for them, that's why there's a rise in like buying land, or even saying land with agricultural activity, whereas amongst Black people, with the rise of the middle class, it's seen as, okay, there's no need for the land anymore because you're developing. Yeah.
And by the way, two things can be right at the same time, you know. Just also to you, you know, like two things can be true at the same time about, that's why there's a chicken and egg situation, that we not always have to say that, especially if you've got like a dividing society where inequality is growing, a big Black middle class is growing, and some poorer people are becoming poorer. And then what is true for these, although they're Black, they're young, what is true for them is not true for these also Black and young. You know, so then you find that there are two different explanations working in parallel, but for two different subgroups. So we should never shy away from the fact that we can have two truths. Yes, over to you, Prof.
Thank you. I mean, my comment is connected to these 2 points. What's your name?
Okay.
Tonela. You know, I just wonder, Tonela, when I was younger, I remember that, you know, families had, you had your garden in front of you, fairly big in the rural areas, and you still had another field that you worked. And what has been striking to me is how a lot of those fields, certainly in my rural area, are no longer being used. Some of them now, you're beginning to see some houses being built, but the large parts of those lands is just completely vacant. And then the other thing that has been striking to me, even for the young people that don't have degrees, and mostly young Black men, we have been struggling as families to even get some of those to look after the cattle or to work the garden, you know, that is immediately in our homestead. What I see in many rural areas, especially in the Eastern Cape, is that a lot of young men from Lesotho are doing that job. So how do we explain even that sort of, is it a lack of interest, you know, from those young men who don't have even the education? But what I like about what you're saying is that how we're trying to make sense of this is the idea of success that is completely now almost urbanized, right? I think what might need to change, especially for the African youth, is this idea of success, which is connected to either having a salaried job, getting into some networks. It's connected to having these fast cars, you know, and being able to go party somewhere. I think what might need to change is that the idea of work as well as the idea of success.
The youth culture, you know, the social media culture that's affecting, displaying what.
When young people say they want to secure the bag, they're not securing it through agriculture. I mean, you know, when I was asking them in my undergraduate class, you know, what is the morality of these young people? What is your idea of success? They say, no, we just want to secure the bag. And that is not connected to waiting for the seasons of being an agricultural worker. I mean, that's just to many young people, they can tell me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it takes too long.
So do you think if we were to have like a cohort of young Black youth who we display on social media as being amazing cases of success and, you know, having secured the bag, that might have a cultural impact in the way that young people are perceiving perceiving the sector. You know, I mean, what we see now, you know, is people with big chains, you know, I don't know, drugs.
But even in the soap operas, and I didn't want to speak too much. You know, in the early 90s, whether it was generations or sitting, or there was a version of work, the board meetings that they were going to, the mines and the sitting, or there was a sense that one has to work. But when I watch the soaps these days, people are just having champagne every day. You can't tell it's Monday or Saturday, you know, and that's tied to the reality TV culture where every day is a party. And so it's fundamental. You have to change the conception of work and the conception of success.
Over to you, Risha, online.
Thank you so much. So we have Prof. Martin Gustafsson, who has raised his hand, and Tito, and then I also have a question from online. So I'm going to first hand it over to Prof. Gustafsson. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Risha, and thanks, Ntlantla. Very interesting use of the data and presentations. I'm Martin Gustafsson. I think I know some other people in the room as well. I have, every now and again, I'm involved in things that ISER does. Yeah, I mean, the one point that kept on coming to my head was urbanization. And I think you're right, Ntlantla, that a lot of what we're seeing here is the result of massive, urbanization. South Africa, you know, over those 20 years has changed enormously. I mean, you have a province like Eastern Cape, which is actually emptying out. It has a population which is continuously on the decline. And that's historically a very rural province. And then you have a province like Gauteng, where essentially the population doubled in 20 years. So massive movements across the country. And obviously one needs to understand things like people's connection to the land and agriculture in terms of those massive urbanization trends. And maybe Ntlantla, you could just clarify a little bit on those figures. So where you're looking at 90% for Black African youth, access to agriculture or agricultural activities. Am I correct in understanding that that means that if you're Black African, back in 2002 or even in 20 years later, your probability of having some engagement with agriculture is higher than for the other population groups? That wouldn't surprise me, but a lot of it is, you know, a legacy of apartheid and, you know, basically rural areas being propped up under the apartheid system and very small scale access to agriculture. So even with the decline for Black Africans are still, in the latest data, more likely to be engaged in agriculture than other groups. I just wanted to check that. But before, one last point on, I'm from I work in education. So I think that in understanding agriculture and land in South Africa, there's not enough emphasis or analysis of the human capital side. So you need skills to change the profile of agriculture, of who does agriculture in South Africa. And I think what's really important is to keep in mind how agricultural education has changed or not changed over time, and how, like in the schooling system, there are two distinct agricultural subjects. There's agricultural sciences, which is very theoretical, very little practical work. Historically, that was a subject that was taken largely by Black students. And even today, there are very few students who are not Black who are taking that subject. On the other hand, you have agricultural technology, which is a subject which was historically kind of kept for whites, but is now a little bit more diverse. It's far more practical. This is where farmers get their training. And tracking the extent to which there's been changes in the participation in that subject is, I think, an important part of understanding why we are not seeing more change or interest in agriculture among young Black South Africans. So those are my points. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin.
Should I
Thank you so
respond to
much.
that, Risha? Or should I?
Okay, you can respond, Prof, and then we have Tito who wanted to comment, and then we have 2 more questions in the chat before you go back to the room.
Yes, yes. Just to the first question that Martin asked. So Martin, we looked at just this, the 100% there on the shared. Am I sharing something, Risha?
Yes, Prof, it's the annual report. I'm not sure if you meant to share that.
No, I meant
Yeah,
the
presentation.
the presentation. Please,
Let me share it for you 1 minute, Prof.
sharing the annual report. Okay, which one do I want to share? I wanted to share this.
Prof, I'm sharing your presentation. Is that okay?
Okay, you can share it, please.
Okay, no, I think you've shared it already.
Okay.
It's fine. Go ahead, Prof.
Okay, so this is only looking at the youth. So because it's percentage shares, it's not telling us. So you can have the fact that the total number of the youth, for example, in agriculture has increased here, both for all the groups. But now the percentage shares within the group have changed. That's what I'm reporting here. So what's the share for Africans compared to colored Indians, and how that within the group itself have changed? So the share in 2002 was bigger for Africans than it is in 2019. But like I say, yeah, like you also say that maybe in rural areas, because we don't really look at how big now is the agricultural land, you know? It's not just that, but also, you know, the total population of Africans, obviously it was bigger it's always been bigger. So it's not absolute numbers. So maybe we should try and also just compare this to whether or not, I think in the SRI, we looked at both old and younger people, but also within the agricultural sector to check compared to the older people what has happened there. I just don't remember the figures. But here, the thing is comparing within young people, you know, across different races. So that's the drop there that we see which is a relative drop, not an absolute drop. But I like the fact you make about the curriculum itself. I know there's also been a big movement towards environmental sustainability. How do we make that part of the curriculum for young people to be? I mean, in Europe, like Finland, it's amazing when you talk to young people. When they talk about the environment, it's almost like it's part of the culture now. So yeah, I guess it's the same thing. In informal education, how do we change? In the informal setup, how do we change how youth think and what is the culture of the youth? It can be done through various things, popular TV, social media, you know, all these trends. The education system is also a part of that. To what extent? So yeah, it's maybe we can also look at, I don't know if there's data that can tell us how do people who are in agricultural schools then performing in, you know, post school compared to everyone else. And therefore, if that is shrinking, agricultural curriculum is shrinking or is shrinking in particular schools, then we should expect the same at a bigger level. So, but thanks for that.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Martin, I assume you want to respond directly to Prof. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes.
Just one point for all the budding analysts here, that I mean, Data First has some data on participation in the matric exams by subject and the results of that. So unfortunately, it's not broken down by race, but it does give one some sense of what's happening when it comes to participation in agricultural subjects. Thanks.
Can you identify school names?
Yes, you can identify school names.
Oh, okay, so then you can almost identify black schools.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Extrapolation. Okay, thank you.
Time, Prof.
Sorry, Prof?
Go ahead with online.
Yes. So Tito, would you still like to make a comment?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, cool. So I have two comments in the chat box. The first one is by Ayanda Ngidi, who said, thank you for the presentation. My concern is the education curriculum in our schools, which is mostly theory and therefore prepares youth to seek employment, which is very scarce. Not much agricultural colleges exist. Also, the wrong mindset which needs to change. Agricultural activities can be associated by some youth as for older generations viewed as not cool. How can tangible skills subjects be reintroduced and marketed right from primary level? Okay, so that is the first question. I think part of it has already been discussed, but I will still provide Prof. Mbatha and Tito an opportunity to respond after I give the next question. The next question is by Dr. Vijay Reddy, who asks, are young people interested in working in the agriculture field? So Prof. Mbatha and Tito, I'm going to open it up for you all to respond before we head back into the seminar room to check for more questions.
Maybe let's ask Tizo. She has not been responding. We need to hear from the youth. We need your insights. We belong to a different culture. 76.
I think just to answer that question, I think for my policy brief, I had to do employment in South Africa. And one of the things that I had to touch on was the post-secondary education training, as well as like just education in general and skills development in South Africa. So I think one critique that does come up about South Africa's education system is that we don't necessarily give people enough practical skills, even if you don't want to enter tertiary education or post-secondary education, which means that we probably should have more of a integrative secondary education, or before you go to university, you should be able to be exposed to practical skills in terms of whether you want to go into agriculture, whether you want to go into, be an artisan or something like that. So I think, Germany has an example of, it's got a dual system, where you can choose practical skills and you can also choose the theory. So I think maybe South Africa could also look into something, more along those lines in terms of getting more of those practical skills amongst the youth before you even get to university or you get to those TVET colleges at a tertiary education level. So I think that could be an option in terms of answering how we have a theory or a curriculum that is way too theory-based.
So Tito, essentially you suggesting that if we focus more on these TVET colleges, which do provide training in technical and vocational education, that should then provide our youth with a more skills-orientated perspective when moving into the labor market compared to the traditional theory-based education that you learn at universities.
Yes, I think, okay, let me stop sounding or trying to sound very academic, but I think, because Prof did say it's like a fireside chat, I think at the very basic level, I think we do need to almost like see how we see certain fields or our aspirations into certain things. So for example, a lot of the times if you go to universities, high school students, they do have the aspiration of that my next step will be university. And a lot of the times universities are very much, you're sitting down theory-based, unless you're, in the sciences doing practicals. But I think maybe if we had more of an approach of, this is a viable option for a lot of high school students to go to, which is TVET colleges, which give you more practical skills. I think we could also, have a greater push for maybe people participating within agriculture. So I think maybe that's definitely like something that we need to look at maybe as the youth. I think as Prof Mbatha just said, because I see she's in the room. So I think, yeah, the way that we see, success as the youth also needs to almost shift. And also the way that we even see our own educational journeys or our trajectories in education also need to shift. So university is not the only, place that you go if you want to become very skilled at something. There's also TVET colleges where you can become very practically skilled at something, and one is not better than the other.
Yeah, so we're almost asking for a change in perspective on what is valued in society, because currently it's only universities, so predominantly traditional universities. Okay, Prof, I'm going to hand over to you for in-person questions. Also, just to note that we have 3 raised hands online, so we will get back to the 3 raised hands online, but Prof, I'm going to hand over for any in-person questions.
Okay, and we're also running out of time.
Yeah.
If not ran out of time, so maybe let's try and take one more question in the room and one more pending question online, because we have to close soon. Is that okay? So I've got, who was first between the two of you? Okay, so you go first. Comment.
Yes, based on what you said, and also Risha and to have touched with now UP, I just want to, because this is a topic of interest for me. There are already initiatives that have been brought forward by the government and that are within the National Development Plan that focus on basically greening the education system. And these initiatives are focusing specifically within TVET programs and greening the curriculum within TVET programs that so that they align with the green economy that South Africa is trying to transition into. And yeah, so that's just a point that I wanted to make, that initiatives are already there.
Okay, maybe because it was a comment. Okay, no, let's look for a question now. Question or comment? Otherwise, we go online. Okay, it's all comments. Your comments are welcome. Let me just write down where comments can be sent to.
So, also,
yes.
we will post the seminar on YouTube, and then we can continue in the YouTube comment section.
Yes,
We welcome comments.
So I just want to write Vuyoka's email address here for inquiries and comments. Go ahead online whilst I'm doing this, Risha.
Okay, so I have 3 hands raised online. I of course I don't know which question is a burning question.
Let's allow them to answer to ask their questions, and then that's fine.
Sure. So it was first Ivan, so you can go ahead. Go ahead, Ivan.
Just take your seat. Just type.
Ivan, you can unmute yourself, and you can also switch on your camera if you would like to.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I would just like to ask a question, and this is that has got to do with our history in terms of our education. We get taught that one person can reach and become successful in anything, and I'm talking about specifically about agriculture, but that's the basic line that we get, is that you have to go and do something great. Is there a way that we can actually teach young people that if they work together, that can also work? That's the one thing, is that how do we also then give them the necessary skills? Like I'm an accountant, and I've offered my service many a times for these small farmers that's gotten land from the government. The government obviously wants a specific way that they're dealing with accounting and services. I've offered mine for free for people to actually, once you go into agriculture, how do you also gain the other skills necessary to actually run a business and actually make a life out of agriculture? So 2 things is that, do we get people to realize that, when you work in groups, sometimes it's better, one keeps the other one responsible, and then the other part is how do we incorporate the other parts of business into agriculture?
Thank you, Irene. Thank you. That's a very valid question because you're right. If you get land, I mean, you need to make it into a business, so you need other business skills. So I'm going to take all three questions and then I'll hand over to Prof and Tito to answer, and then we'll close up. Okay. The next question was from Renosi Mokate. You're welcome to unmute yourself and switch on your camera. Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll be very try to be quick, especially because I missed quite a bit of the report. So I'm basing my comments on what I've heard. First is to agree with the previous speaker that it seems to me that when we're talking about agriculture, almost like as a unidimensional thing, you know, we seem to have a particular idea in our head of what it is that we mean by agriculture. And one of the things that struck me is, are we also encouraging young people to go into allied fields, whether it's marketing or research or whatever that support agriculture? The second point I just wanted to make is that doing agriculture is actually complex, it's difficult, it's risky. And so the ecosystem needs to support somebody who has an interest, because it's very easy to lose interest simply by planting at the wrong time, the weather changing, and a big issue of course, two big issues are finance and access to markets. Because it's one thing to grow stuff, but marketing is a very difficult area as well. So I think it is complex. We need to look at it in all of its complexity, and that the ecosystem is in place to support people, and not only say, if you want to go into agriculture, you need to do land. There are many other allied areas to agriculture that should also be encouraged.
Okay. Thank you so much, Renasi. I think you definitely highlighted very important points that agriculture cannot be seen as unidimensional, and there needs to be some sort of sustainable ecosystem going on. So thank you for that. Tumelo, let me hand over to you quickly.
Thank you so much. And I also appreciate this. It's quite interesting. My question to Prof is how I find that agriculture is such a very dynamic industry, and Ms. Mukate already alluded to that it has spin-offs, you know. But I want to know, with this research, what is the impact to get the other stakeholders that are critical? And Prof talked about 2002, and 2002 is that people then were prepared to open up and make agriculture for everybody. That's why there's that 97% impact. Now in 2025, we are still having issues in agriculture where the skill set hasn't happened. I'm going to use my example. I'm in the hotel business. Agriculture taught me because every morning I have to have breakfast for you ready. But I wanted to find out how the other element in this to make agriculture successful, this research aligned for that. Because it's 20 years later and we're still having the same, what Professor presented is the same with other sectors in South Africa. So I'm very keen to hear how this research is contributing towards that, and how do you operationalize that to solve the issue, because I believe that I'm an expert now in hospitality because I've gone through the grains, you know, over some time, 15 years later, I'm at the prime of my career, I'm able to offer my services in the industry. So my challenge is how the other role players, I'm talking about people who have benefited from agriculture from post-apartheid, before apartheid, how are they contributing towards this? Because this is a problem we know about. You see it, and it touches across the industries, you know. Thank you. That's what I want to ask.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Tumelo. Also raising very important questions. Okay, so Prof and Tito, can I give you guys just a few minutes to answer but also just round up and provide final comments and thoughts before we end. I'm not sure who. Yeah, Tito, maybe you go first and then Prof will end.
Yeah, can I go first and then
Prof
Prof
will
will be
end.
like, we'll end everything.
Okay.
I think there's a lot that's been mentioned. I think, you know, the allied, you know, approach to agriculture, you know, how also, you know, agriculture is not unidimensional, so that the idea that, you know, you can learn how to farm, but you also need to know how to sell crops to, you know, a market. And then I think in terms of the ecosystem, I'm going to go back to the idea of social protection and social grants. I think it goes back down to the industrial psychology of the fact that if someone has some type of social protection in place, they're more willing to take risks, which means that they're more willing to engage within economic activities, which means that if people know for a fact that they're, you know, at least receiving something or getting something at the end of the day, they're more willing to engage with that. So I think when we have greater social protections, being social grants, cash transfers, I think we can then see better engagement with, you know, agriculture from, you know, the ecosystem. So I think maybe like ensuring that, because, you know, I think also one of the things is that, you know, we can't lie and say agriculture is not, you know, an inequality of the past, because it really is. Those that, you know, have always been able to engage have done so because of the legacies of the past. So I think if we want more people to engage within this field, especially the youth, we need better social protections. And I think that's how we can go about, you know, creating more of a social ecosystem. The rest I will give over to Prof, because I know Prof will answer everything perfectly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. Mbatha.
Okay, so on the first question and comment on collective and private rights, I think there are a lot more problems with the collective recipients of land redistribution programs. And obviously, you know, you would expect that with more people, it's sometimes the tragedy of the commons. Sometimes people look after one another and keep each other accountable, but you know, most of the case studies are people, there's lots of infighting. And so you find that, at least in my experience, that private owners or private managers of farms tend to perform better than communities. Yeah, for various reasons. You know, they're just lots more that is uncertain when you've got more elements in place. Normally what then would happen is that collective people then would like hire, like, you know, maybe a company, get into a joint venture, and then they do better as a community if in cases where that has happened, especially here in the Eastern Cape, in the citrus industry. Around 2004, there was lots of issues around Fort Beaufort with citrus, but many of those within like 10 years. Yeah, so there were very successful cases of joint ventures that happened there. So, but yeah, it's two different systems, two different approaches with two different sets of challenges happening there. This particular study is more like really a scoping at a national level. Sometimes we do present cases. For example, in Matatiele, we had a case of marketing, the marketing end side of the agricultural value chain, where we're talking about how people are now marketing cattle. In fact, we're looking not in production of crops or things like that, but just like looking at markets and more the high end of the agricultural value chain. So some of the issues that I discussed here today are probably more at the lower end of the value chain. Yeah, we can make that explicit, you know, with, you know, different types of reports that we do, that we are looking at this side, we are in the middle of the value chain. You know, when we're talking about marketing, that's almost the, you know, the consumer end of the agricultural value chain. But it is important to appreciate that it's a long value chain, but also the people who are on the higher end of the value chain are not experiencing some of the challenges of food insecurity that we're talking about here. You know, when people are able to participate in big commercial auctions of livestock, those are not the people who are going to be reporting that they are always hungry. So we need to also to differentiate. That's why I also mentioned it appears the gap is splitting with the middle class that's growing, and then people who are being left behind, mostly in poverty. So we still need to pay attention to both sides of the coin, agricultural coin. Deal with the successful cases, for example, of marketing and the other very high end of the value chain, while still actually talking about rural communities, subsistence farming. But we can't, I don't think it's possible to discuss everything in the same report or same paper, especially. So, but I appreciate the comments. Yeah, and some of the research that we've done is on different parts of this. Yeah, so on my side, thank you so much, but we obviously are happy to take suggestions for also for collaborations, you know. Please send us, we you know, we can together, you know, explore ways in which you could, the people who've learned useful lessons, we can take them into the field in different types of agricultural activities for them to figure out ways in which they could support not just young people, but also, you know, people who are on pensions, etc. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for summing it up, Prof. And that brings us to the end of another, what I think is a successful seminar. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us in person and online. We really appreciate your time. We also appreciate your engagement in this very important topic that we continue to experience in South Africa. Again, thank you, Prof. Mbatha, and thank you, Titso, for the discussion. It was really, really informative, also very engaging, and well done, Titso. That was good, very insightful from a youth perspective. Very well done. So lastly, please follow our social media channels, and then the YouTube link will be is available, I think, by tomorrow or so. So have a great afternoon and take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Okay, so let's have cake. Everyone who came for cake, there's sugar, and then we can continue talking. Yes, yes, yes.
On how it promotes sustainability through the post-sports. My cousin did it. A lot of people are taking it in.
Do you want to write? Whose book is this? Whose book? I love this. But please, I'll take a picture. Please write. Hello.
The book is me.
Oh, thank you. He will write and then I'll take a picture. Okay, I think we don't to. You can end the recording. Has it ended? Yeah.